Welcome back to Russian Khton. Today's story is about a child of the 90s, exiled to the deep provinces, and a miracle born on the scorching, unforgiving asphalt of Moscow. Let's begin.
The scent of developing fluid is sharp, chemical, and entirely magical. For the first 10 years of Anya's life, it was the smell of home. Her parents were photographers, not the kind who shot stiff, smiling portraits for passports, but true artists who captured the raw, bleeding edge of the 1990s in Russia. Their Moscow apartment was a labyrinth of hanging negatives, vintage lenses, and laughter. But in the ruthless, wild era of Russian capitalism, art often intersected with dangerous money. The car crash on the icy Leningradskoye highway was a tragic, senseless accident. A heavy Kamaz truck simply lost control on the black ice, crossing the median and crushing their small sedan. Anya, thrown clear into the snowbank, survived. Her parents did not. In the immediate, bureaucratic nightmare that followed, the Opekuni, the state-appointed legal guardians, stepped in. They were distant relatives of her father, an aunt and uncle Anya had barely seen. They wore sympathetic masks for the social workers, dabbing dry eyes with cheap handkerchiefs, but the moment the ink dried on the custody papers, the masks slipped. Within a month, the opportunistic guardians quietly privatized and sold the sprawling Moscow apartment, pocketing the cash. Anya was packed into a train and sent to the Glubinka, the deep, deafening province, to live in a decaying wooden house with the guardian's elderly, alcoholic mother. For the next 8 years, Anya's life was reduced to survival. She lived in an izba, a traditional log cabin that offered romantic charm to city tourists, but meant frozen water buckets and chopping firewood at 5 a.m. for the people who actually lived in them. Her guardians kept the orphan welfare checks, leaving Anya to earn her keep. By the time she was 16, she was working as a seamstress for the village women, her fingers calloused and pricked black by cheap needles. Yet, in the dead of night, while the wind howled through the cracks in the logs, Anya would hold her hands up to her eyes, forming a rectangle with her thumbs and forefingers. She would frame the moonlight spilling across the floorboards. She had lost her parents, her home, and her childhood, but she refused to lose their way of seeing the world. Everything changed the summer the Moscow elite arrived. Near Anya's village lay a pristine lake, surrounded by high, impenetrable green metal fences. Behind these fences were the dachas of the wealthy. In Russia, a dacha can mean a crooked wooden shack where a pensioner grows potatoes to survive the winter. Or it can mean a 4-story brick fortress with a heated pool. Artem's family owned the latter. Artem was 28, a brilliant, fast-rising surgeon on the verge of a prestigious 2-year international medical fellowship. He was entirely alien to the village landscape. He smelled of expensive cologne, wore clean white sneakers that never seemed to touch the mud, and possessed a smile that had never known true hunger. They met by the lake. Anya was washing heavy woolen blankets in the icy water, her hands red and raw. Artem had been jogging. He stopped, mesmerized not just by her striking, unpolished beauty, but by the way she was staring at the reflection of the thunderclouds in the rippling water, entirely lost in the composition of the sky. "You look at things differently than other people," Artem told her softly, handing her a towel he had draped over his neck. That summer was a brief, blinding flash of light in the dark room of Anya's life. They met in secret, walking through the birch groves. Artem didn't look at her like a village seamstress. He looked at her like she was the most precious thing he had ever discovered. When she shyly confessed her dream of photography, he didn't laugh. The next week, he brought her a gift, a heavy, mechanical Soviet Zenit camera. It was scuffed, the leather peeling, but the optics were flawless. On the metal base, he had clumsily scratched his initials with a pocket knife, a V. "For your first exhibition?" He smiled, kissing her forehead. Autumn came, carrying the bitter chill of reality. Artem was scheduled to leave for his surgical residency in Munich. The night before his departure, he wrote Anya a long, impassioned letter, promising to send for her, begging her to wait. He left it with his mother's driver to deliver to the village. The letter never reached Anya's hands. Instead, a sleek black Mercedes pulled up to the rotting wooden fence of Anya's izba. Artem's mother, Elena, stepped out. She was a woman carved from marble, a cornerstone of the Moscow elite, wearing a cashmere coat and lips painted a severe, bloodless nude. Anya stood in the muddy yard, wiping dirt from her hands onto her apron. "Let us not play games, girl," Elena said, her voice as smooth and cold as the hood of her car. "Artem is gone. He is in Germany, and when he returns, he is marrying the daughter of the Deputy Minister of Health. It was arranged years ago." "That's a lie," Anya whispered, her heart dropping into her stomach. "He loves me." Elena let out a short, dry laugh. "He pities you. He is a doctor. He has a complex for saving wounded animals. But a man of his status does not marry a seamstress who smells of cheap soap and potato peelings. He asked me to come here to pay you off so you wouldn't make a scene and embarrass him." Elena reached into her designer bag, pulled out a thick stack of American dollars, and threw them onto the muddy ground at Anya's feet. "Buy yourself a new dress, and never look at my family again." The car drove away, leaving Anya standing in the mud. The crushing weight of her class, her poverty, and her absolute insignificance broke her. She didn't pick up the money. She went inside, packed her few belongings, wrapped the Zenit camera in a woolen sweater, and left the village that very night. She did not flee to another city. She relied entirely on Avos, that uniquely Russian concept of blind, desperate faith that somehow the road will catch you if you throw yourself onto it. She took an Elektrichka commuter train straight back into the belly of Moscow. She deliberately lost herself in a sprawling, gray industrial district on the far eastern edge of the megapolis, a place of smokestacks and shadows where no one asked questions and a girl from the provinces could disappear. A month later, staring at two blue lines on a cheap plastic test in a communal bathroom, Anya realized she was pregnant. The next 6 years were a blur of grinding, relentless exhaustion. Anya lived in an общежитие, a massive workers' dormitory attached to an old textile plant, where a long, dimly lit corridor of peeling wallpaper connected 20 cramped rooms to a single, chaotic communal kitchen. It was a place where privacy did not exist, but community did. When her son, Ilya, was born, Anya thought her heart would burst with a love so fierce it physically ached. But Ilya was fragile. At 2 years old, he was diagnosed with a severe cardiac arrhythmia. To pay for his medications and specialist visits, Anya worked at the local garment sweatshop, sewing cheap winter coats for 14 hours a day. Her salvation came in the form of Zina and Toma, 2 older women who worked the machines next to her. They were rough, loud, provincial women who smoked strong cigarettes and cursed like sailors, but they possessed hearts of absolute gold. When Anya couldn't afford milk, Zina quietly slipped cartons into her bag. When Ilya was sick with a fever, Toma sat up with him all night in the общага room, placing cold compresses on his forehead so Anya could sleep for 3 hours. "Men are trash, Anyuta," Zina would say, pouring incredibly strong black tea into a granulny staikan, the classic Soviet-faceted glass. She'd push a spoonful of raspberry jam toward Anya. "But we women, we hold the sky up. Eat the jam. You're entirely transparent. The wind will blow you away." Anya never told them about Artem. She locked that memory away in a dark box, throwing away the key. The only piece of him that remained was the Zenit camera, sitting broken and useless on the shelf, a toy for little Ilya. The breaking point arrived on a suffocatingly hot afternoon in late July. Anya was walking Ilya home from the district clinic. The asphalt of Moscow radiated a blinding, oppressive heat, shimmering with exhaust fumes. Ilya, now 6 years old, was pale and sweating, his small hand gripping his mother's tightly. He was carrying his little blue backpack, which contained his favorite toy, the heavy, broken camera. Suddenly Ilya stopped. He let out a small, quiet gasp. His hand flew to his chest. "Ilyusha?" Anya asked, turning around. The boy's eyes rolled back into his head. He collapsed onto the scorching pavement, his tiny body seizing violently, his lips turning a terrifying shade of blue. "Help!" Anya screamed, dropping to her knees, tearing at the collar of his shirt. "Somebody please, call the Skoraya, ambulance." A crowd immediately formed. In Russia, a crowd of bystanders is a chaotic force of nature. Babushkas crossed themselves and offered useless folk remedies. Men shouted into their cell phones, but no one knew what to do. The nearest state hospital was trapped in gridlock traffic. The ambulance would take 20 minutes. Ilya was dying right there on the sidewalk. A black luxury SUV, navigating the outer city traffic, screeched to a halt at the curb, mounting the sidewalk. A man threw the door open and sprinted through the crowd. "I'm a doctor, step back!" he roared, his voice cutting through the panic with absolute authority. He dropped to his knees beside Anya. He didn't look at her. His entire focus was on the dying boy. He checked the pulse, tilted Ilya's head back, and immediately began chest compressions. His hands moved with surgical, mechanical precision. "Come on, buddy. Come on," the doctor muttered, sweat dripping from his brow. Anya was paralyzed, kneeling in the dust, her hands covering her mouth, sobbing hysterically. She looked at the doctor. The broad shoulders, the profile, the dark hair, now peppered with a few strands of gray. The earth stopped spinning. The air left her lungs. It was Artem. "He's in ventricular fibrillation. We need him in an ER right now," Artem shouted to his driver, who was already running over. Artem scooped the limp boy into his arms. "You," he barked at Anya, still not truly looking at her face through the adrenaline of the crisis. "Get in the car." The ride to his private medical center in the city core was a blur of blaring horns and red lights. Artem carried Ilya straight through the swinging double doors of the resuscitation unit, barking orders to his pediatric cardiac team, before being forced by medical ethics and his own violently trembling hands to stay behind the glass of the observation deck. You do not open the chest of a patient you brought in from the street while running on pure adrenaline. He left Anya collapsed on a plastic chair in the waiting room. For 2 hours, Anya sat in absolute silence. She didn't pray. She just stared at the linoleum floor, her mind completely shattered. Artem, here, in Moscow, saving their son. It was a statistical impossibility, a cruel, miraculous joke of the universe. Finally, the heavy doors opened. Artem walked out, wearing green scrubs over his shirt. He looked exhausted, rubbing the back of his neck. He walked toward Anya, holding a clipboard. "He's stable," Artem said gently. "My top pediatric surgeon took over. They had to use the defibrillator, but his rhythm has normalized. He's going to be fine. We just need to—" Artem stopped. He looked at the woman sitting on the plastic chair, the cheap, faded clothes, the pale face, the large, terrified eyes that he had never, not for a single day in 8 years, forgotten. The clipboard slipped from his fingers and hit the linoleum with a loud crack. "Anya," he whispered. His voice was completely devoid of oxygen. Anya stood up slowly. She nodded, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes. Artem took a step forward, his hands shaking. "My God, Anya, I looked everywhere for you. I hired people. I hired the best private investigators in Moscow. When I came back from Germany, I drove through every village in that region. I checked the state registries. You were just gone. You came back?" Anya's voice was barely a rasp. "But your mother, she said you were marrying the minister's daughter. She brought money to the village. She told me you asked her to pay me off." Artem froze. The color drained from his face, leaving it a sickly, chalky white. The pieces of the puzzle missing for 8 agonizing years violently slammed into place. "My mother told you what?" he breathed, his fists clenching so hard his knuckles popped. "Anya, I sent you a letter. I begged you to wait for me. I hired detectives to find you, but my mother, she had the family security chief intercept them. She bribed them to forge reports saying you had married a local and immigrated to Belarus. She actively, methodically buried your existence to protect her own ambitions for me." Before he could say another word, a nurse walked into the waiting room, holding Ilya's little blue backpack. "Dr. Vorontsov," the nurse said gently. "We took off the boy's clothes for the ICU. This was in his bag. Should I put it with the patient's belongings?" Artem looked down. Protruding from the unzipped backpack was the heavy, scuffed, metal body of a Soviet Zenit camera. Artem reached out with a shaking hand and took it. He turned it over. There, scratched into the metal base, were the faded initials AV. He looked at the camera. He looked at Anya. He looked toward the doors of the intensive care unit, where a 6-year-old boy with his exact dark hair and his exact jawline was sleeping on a ventilator. Tears welled up in the eyes of the brilliant, hardened 36-year-old chief of surgery. He fell to his knees right there in the sterile hallway of his own hospital. "He's mine," Artem sobbed, pressing the cold metal of the camera against his forehead. He's my son. Anya dropped to her knees beside him, wrapping her arms around his shaking shoulders, burying her face in his neck. Yes, she cried. Yes, he's yours. The retribution was swift, surgical, and absolutely devastating. Artem was no longer a naive medical student under his family's thumb. He was a wealthy, highly connected director of a major medical center, wielding his own considerable power. The day after Ilya was stabilized, Artem walked into his mother's immaculate Moscow estate. He didn't yell. He simply placed a photograph of Ilya on her antique mahogany dining table, looked into her cold, perfectly manicured face, and said, "You are dead to me. Do not ever attempt to contact my family again." He walked out without looking back, severing ties with the dynasty that had tried to control him. But Artem didn't stop there. He wanted to understand why Anya had been forced into that miserable village to begin with. He hired an elite, unbribable corporate investigator to dig into the aftermath of the crash that killed Anya's parents. 3 months later, the investigator brought a thick dossier to Artem's office. The car crash had indeed been a genuine, unavoidable tragedy, but the Guardians' actions afterward were a masterclass in predatory fraud. They hadn't just legally outmaneuvered a traumatized child for a Moscow apartment. Anya's father hadn't just been a street photographer. He had amassed one of the most comprehensive, uncensored archives of the Soviet underground rock and dissident movement of the 1980s. It was a historical goldmine. The Opekuni, the greedy Guardians, had discovered the archive hidden in the apartment. They quietly forged ownership documents, exiled Anya to the village, and secretly sold the entire negative archive to a private Western collector for a staggering sum of money. They had built their comfortable lives entirely on the stolen legacy of Anya's family. Armed with the investigators' undeniable proof, Artem's lawyers unleashed hell. The Guardians were dragged into criminal court, faced with years in a penal colony for gross embezzlement, fraud, and the theft of a minor's inheritance. They desperately surrendered everything they had. Their assets were liquidated, their accounts frozen and seized. The Western collector, terrified of international bad press and a messy legal battle over stolen intellectual property, agreed to a massive financial settlement and the immediate return of the digital rights to the archive. Justice, delayed for a decade, finally arrived. A year later, the gray, industrial gloom of the Moscow outskirts felt like a distant memory. Anya stood in the center of a massive, loft-style studio in the trendy, artistic heart of central Moscow. The walls were exposed red brick, bathed in natural light pouring through floor-to-ceiling windows. On the pristine white walls hung massive, beautifully framed black and white photographs. Her father's restored archive, side by side with Anya's own breathtaking raw portraits of provincial life. Above the entrance, sleek black letters spelled out, "The Zenith Studio." "Move that light stand to the left," a loud, commanding voice boomed across the room. "And be careful with the cables, you clumsy bear." Anya smiled, watching Zina march across the hardwood floor. Zina was wearing a stylish black blazer, though she still cursed like a factory worker. Behind her, Toma was meticulously adjusting a rack of high-end vintage dresses used for styled shoots. When Anya had received the multi-million ruble compensation from the fraud settlement, she hadn't just bought a house and a studio. She had driven her new car straight back to the Obshchaga. She had walked into the sweatshop, handed the terrible manager a letter of resignation for both her friends, and taken Zina and Toma with her. They were now the studio managers, paid salaries they had once thought existed only in soap operas. They were family. The studio door chimed. Artem walked in, wearing a tailored suit, carrying a healthy, energetic 7-year-old boy on his shoulders. Ilya's cheeks were rosy, his heart fully repaired by Artem's hand-picked surgical team. In his small hands, he held a brand-new digital camera. "Mama, look!" Ilya shouted, pointing the lens at her. "Smile!" Anya laughed, a bright, ringing sound that filled the massive space. She walked over, wrapping her arms around her son and her husband. Artem kissed her softly, his hand resting on the small of her back. "The lighting in here is perfect," Artem murmured, looking around the bustling, joyful studio. "It is," Anya agreed, resting her head against his chest. listening to the strong, steady beat of his heart. She looked over at Zena and Toma, who were arguing loudly over how to arrange the teacups on a tray, and then down at her son, who was busy taking photos of the floor. She had been thrown under the freezing road of life, relying entirely na avos. But the road hadn't broken her. It had led her through the dark room, exposing her to the harsh chemicals of betrayal and poverty, only to finally develop the perfect, brilliant picture of the life she was always meant to have.
In the end, cold elite dynasties and greedy guardians crumble. True family isn't born in marble estates, it's found in a cramped dormitory over a faceted glass of strong black tea. Thank you for watching, see you in next video.